Take control of your finances in 2026 with a personal access line of credit from Sharon View Federal Credit Union. With competitive rates and great service, start the new year off right. Visit SharonView.org. Membership eligibility required. All loans subject to credit approval.
Hello, your friendly neighborhood host, JT Wheatley here again, back for another episode of the History of Comics podcast. This time with part 2 of the rivalry between Marvel and DC. When we last left off, Marvel and DC had both established themselves as the preeminent American comic book publishers, and Marvel had just recently surpassed DC, which had long been number one in comic book sales. Now they would continue a rivalry, but for a little while, they would even get along. Martin Goodman, the founder of Marvel, continued to attack DC by flooding the market with Marvel books, and Stan Lee would inadvertently do something that would not only further define the difference between Marvel and DC, but change American comic books forever. The U.S. Department of Health had recently approached Marvel about producing an anti-drug story, realizing a lot of kids read comic books. It says something that even the U.S. government knew to approach DC over Marvel at the time. And Stan Lee agreed, commissioning a story for Amazing Spider-Man numbers 96 to 98 from May to July of 1971. However, the Comics Code Authority forbid any depiction of drug use, even negative ones, and wouldn't give the story its seal of approval. Seeing as how they had the U.S. Department of Health support, Marvel printed the story anyway, without the CCA approval seal. From DC's perspective, Marvel's move was outrageous, specifically by Carmen Infantino, who stated that they wanted to do an anti-drug story themselves, but wanted to do it without cold approval. In fact, they planned to run one in Green Lantern Green Arrow about Speedy, Arrow's sidekick, being a heroin addict, complete with a cover of him shooting up by Neil Adams, but the CCA rejected it. However, when Infantino's criticism would soon look out of place when the Amazing Spider-Man story was universally acclaimed for its message, while the CCA was criticized for being behind in the times and trying to prevent such an important story from being printed. The resulting backlash led to the CCA to revamp its code for the first time since its inception 17 years ago on February of 1971, not only allowing for more morally gray stories like drug ones, but finally allowing horror characters to return to American comic books. Plus, that Green Arrow Green Lantern story finally got published. Marvel would soon take advantage of this rule change with such classic horror series like Tomb of Dracula, while DC was able to introduce a character like the Swamp Thing in House of Secrets number 92 on July of 1971, created by Lynn Wein and artist Bernie Wrightson, though you would probably never hear them thank Marvel over it. In fact, there was a controversy over Swamp Thing, as Marvel accused DC of ripping off their own Man-Thing, created by Stan Lee, Roy Thomas, Jerry Conway, and Gray Morrow back in Savage Tales number 1 on May of 1971. DC countered, stating that they were both variations of the character The Heap, a Golden Age creature created by Harry Stein and Maurice Leave in Air Fighters number 3 in December of 1942, and both sides finally decided to leave each other alone over it. Marvel did get another jab at DC when Martin Goodman learned that while DC held the copyright to the Fawcett character Captain Marvel, which they acquired after falsely suing the company over claiming it was a ripoff of Superman, they had lost the trademark to the name. The character was originally created at Fawcett in February of 1940 by Bill Parker and C.C. Beck in Whiz Comics number 2, starring the kid Billy Batson, who when uttering the word Shazam, transformed into an adult hero Captain Marvel. While he had only a passing resemblance to Superman, along with actually flying while Superman was still just leaping tall buildings with a single bound at the time, that didn't stop DC head Jack Leibowitz from suing Fawcett over copyright infringement, eventually forcing him to cease publication of the character in 1953. The character remained popular, leading to a deal in 1972 where DC acquired the rights to Captain Marvel, but in the interim time, the trademark had expired. A brief explanation about the difference between a copyright and a trademark. Copyright is what the intellectual property actually is, while the trademark is what you call it. Similar to a patent being for what a Toyota Corolla is, while the trademark is the name of the Corolla. By law, trademarks expire a lot faster when not used, which is what happened to Captain Marvel, with the name reappearing in 1996 under MF Enterprises as an attempt to squat on it. However, Marvel intended to claim that name for itself, thus paid MF $4,500 in a legal settlement. Then Goodman ordered Stan Lee to create a Captain Marvel for Marvel, thus fully claiming the trademark for themselves. The new character appeared in Marvel Superheroes number 12 on January of 1967, with Gene Colan providing the art. The Marvel version was an alien Kree warrior and would get his own series in 1968, which ran for 2 years. DC would protest and even try to sneak Captain Marvel's name into their own comic, but Marvel quickly threatened legal action. They even tried to cheat, calling him the original Captain Marvel on the comic's covers, but even that was nixed by Marvel, thus changing Shazam's name to the World's Mightiest Mortal with Shazam number 15 in December of 1974. Thus, the character is known in DC as Shazam to this day, along being awkward for the hero as he can't say his name without transforming back into Billy Batson, while Captain Marvel is currently on the 4th version with Carol Danvers' character. An additional, more recent sting, the recent Captain Marvel movie from Marvel Studios grossed $1.41 billion worldwide, while Shazam from DC Warner Brothers of that same year did just $364 million. While all this fighting between Marvel and DC did drive the competition to improve their books for the readers, they did want them to get along a little bit, if only so some of their favorite characters could finally meet. As the fan community grew in comic books, many started asking, what would happen if Captain America and Superman met, or who was the fastest, the Flash or Quicksilver? Marvel and DC weren't quite listening yet, but there was some cooperation starting between the companies, if not with their approval. In Avengers number 69 in October of 1969, by Roy Thomas and Sal Buscema, it introduced Squadron Sinister, a knockoff of the Justice League, but as villains. For example, Hyperion is a stand-in for Superman, while Nighthawk is a version of Batman. In Justice League of America number 75 in November 1969, the Avengers were referenced in return when battling evil versions of themselves, but in a subtler ways. For example, Batman threw a trash can lit like Captain America, and Superman's evil twin proclaims he's as powerful as Thor. Then, in issue number 87 on February 1971, the Champions of Angor were introduced as Avengers stand-in. Marvel would follow suit with Avengers number 85 on February 1971, would introduce the Squadron Supreme, a team of good guys related to the Squadron Sinister, complete with being JLL ripoffs. Marvel then later would bring back the Squadron Supreme in 1985 with a miniseries, complete with an ad proclaiming they were the Justice League done right, which naturally angered DC. This didn't stop the clandestine crossover in Marvel and DC, which is more overt in a series of issues starting in Amazing Adventures number 16 in January 1973, and going to JLA number 103 in December 1972, and Thor of 207 on December 1972, all by Steve Englehart, Jerry Conway, and Len Wein. While each story stood on its own, together it told a larger narrative, all without DC or Marvel's approval. Another unofficial Marvel-DC crossover came when writer Steve Englehart and his character the Mantis, a green-skinned martial artist who first appeared in Avengers number 112 on June of 1973, was co-created and penciled by Don Heck. She would eventually become a member of the team, later making her live-action debut in Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 on 2017. However, after Englehart went to DC to write the Justice League of America, he would have her appear in issue number 142 on June of 1973, this time under the name Willow. When asked where she came from, Willow answers, "This one comes from a place that she must not name, to reach a place no man must know." This would be part of Englehart choosing to continue his creation despite moving from different companies. Willow would leave Justice League 2 issues later to give birth, only to reappear in Scorpio Rose number 2 at Eclipse Comics now, this time called Lorelei, and having given birth to her son. She then appeared in the Coyote Collection at Image Comics, and Lorelei's name has even been dropped in Englehart's novel The Long Man in 2010. Mantis, Willow, Lorelei has gotten around, to say the least. While all this was happening, DC and Marvel, and specifically Carmen Infantino and Stan Lee, decided to cooperate in another aspect when they agreed to share their page rates, originally to avoid having freelancers try to play them off each other. It came about when freelance artist Frank Robbins lied to Marvel about what DC was paying him for a better deal. However, when Roy Thomas found out about this, he resigned as editor-in-chief in protest at Marvel, and the rate sharing never came about. It would be illegal collusion between companies on top of everything else. The cooperation continued between DC and Marvel in other ways, such as when both companies discovered they were working on an adaptation of the classic Wizard of Oz story, and they agreed to make it a co-production in 1975, called MGM's Marvelous Wizard of Oz, the first official co-production between the two companies. All this laid the groundwork for their two flagship characters to finally meet, Superman and Spider-Man. It all began with literary agent David Ost worked with Marvel and Stan Lee to produce a series of hardcover books from Simon & Schuster, such as Origins of Marvel Comics and Sons of Origins of Marvel Comics. With these connections, Oates met with Howard Kaminsky, the head of Warner Books, who proposed putting a book of Superman and Spider-Man meeting. When Oates floated the idea to Stan Lee, he liked it, but worried it would help DC more than Marvel, until Roy Thomas pointed out that it worked for Marvel as well, as it essentially elevated Spider-Man to Superman's level, since he was still the number one superhero after all. Oates served as a neutral arbitrator, as there were plenty of details to work out, and he would later joke that ecumenical conferences from the Middle Ages were easier. DC demanded more than half the profits, and the Superman would be first in the title, since he had higher distribution, which Marvel actually agreed to. DC still carried its ego that they were the best, that Marvel never let it get in the way at the time. In addition, the labor was to be evenly split, with Marvel providing the penciler and colorist, while DC provided the writer, inker, and letterer. By this point, Jerry Conway had left Marvel for DC. Carmine Infantino was reportedly shocked when he found out he was just 21, despite already having celebrated runs on Fantastic Four and The Amazing Spider-Man, the latter of which included the death of Gwen Stacy and the creation of the Punisher. Infantino tapped Conway to be the writer of the crossover, believing it was a way to stick it to Marvel, but Conway would be an ideal choice, being a former Spider-Man writer as well. DC then requested Ross Andru as the artist, which also seemed a natural choice considering he was the current penciler on Amazing Spider-Man. But that also meant taking him off Marvel's top book, which so incensed editor and Spider-Man writer Len Wein he reportedly nearly attacked the executive who made the decision. Dick Giordano was made inker, while Roy Thomas was serving as consulting editor, as bad blood still existed between Jerry Conway and some of the Marvel editors over leaving for DC. The plot had Spider-Man and Superman battling Dr. Octopus and Lex Luthor, though the details of the story would still have to be worked out. One DC creator accurately pointed out that Superman could throw Spider-Man to Jupiter if he wanted to. Conway worked out that Superman would pull his punches, only sending Spider-Man a few hundred feet instead of into orbit. In addition, both characters would have equal screen time down to the number of pages and panels. It was also decided that, at least for this book, Spider-Man and Superman existed in the same universe or were even aware of each other before actually meeting. Conway also included a fun subplot in which the heads of the Daily Planet and the Daily Bugle, Morgan Edge and J. Jonah Jameson, have a barroom meeting where they complain about their employees, Clark Kent and Peter Parker, always disappearing during a crisis. Finally, Superman vs. The Amazing Spider-Man, The Battle of the Century, was released in January of 1976 for a then astounding price of $2, along with an awkward tabloid-sized format that made it hard for some retailers to place in the standard comic book racks. The book began with an introduction by Carmine Infantino and Stan Lee, touting the companies teaming up, and despite all these difficulties, Superman vs. Spider-Man would sell 500,000 copies, making it all seem worthwhile. This brief aside, the success aside, though, Carmine Infantino found himself fired for one too many failures. DC lost $1 million in 1975, along with making more than a few enemies in the business who helped usher him the way out. DC had tried books like The Stalker and Richard Dragon that last meant to catch up to the martial arts movie craze. However, it was more likely trying to just follow Marvel, who originally capitalized on it with Shang-Chi, which had successfully run for 2 years. By the time Dragon came out, the craze had passed with the series failing, though the character is a mainstay in DC now. All of this led to DC to find some new blood, resulting in the hiring of Jeanette Kahn. Already a successful children's book publisher, she was brought on as consultant Warner Brothers on the whether to end DC Comics outright. Kahn, a longtime comic book fan herself, argued against it, stating that without the original comic books, all the toys, cartoons, and other merchandise venues would eventually dry up. Apparently, this impressed Warner Brothers enough to make her the new publisher of DC, beginning on February 2nd, 1976. One of the first things Jeanette Kahn did was try to treat DC creators better, along with making the comic books better themselves, setting up a system that forced new stories to climb a ladder before finally being made into a finished comic book. To do this, Kahn set out to bring in new talent, recruiting Steve Englehart from Marvel, who revamped Justice League of America in 1977, and then in Detective Comics, helping bring about Batman to his dark roots. Englehart also brought a much-needed dose of maturity to the comic, creating Batman's new girlfriend, Silver St. John, and in a breakthrough for DC at the time, confirmed that Batman was having sex with a scene of St. Cloud telling Bruce Wayne she was exhausted from the previous night. Granted, over at Marvel, this was nothing new, as the sexual activity of such characters as Nick Fury and Iron Man had long been confirmed, while Mr. Fantastic and the Invisible Woman had long since married and had children in Fantastic Four. Kahn also had national publications officially renamed DC in 1976, and of course it officially been called that for years, complete with a new logo designed by Milton Glasser, the legendary designer who known for the I Heart New York campaign, for $25,000. Plus, the DC staff were finally able to stop wearing ties at work, and the office was redecorated to be more fun, with a Superman statue installed in the lobby, while Kahn even had a baseball jacket made for her to read Superman, the comic book, and timing with the release of the upcoming Superman the movie. All this led to the DC explosion in 1978, which came with a price jump to 50 cents from 35 cents, along with a new lineup of books to compete with Marvel. To do this, DC reportedly instituted a warm body plan, according to writer Mike W. Barr, implying that if you were a warm body, you got a job at DC. Kahn set about to fill these roles by poaching many of Marvel's talent, including Len Wein, Jerry Conway, Roy Thomas, Marv Wolfman, George Perez, and Russ Andrew. When Stan Lee was asked about this at a 1978 speaking engagement, he bluntly stated that Marvel would sell more books than ever, while DC's move would probably fall flat on its face. Lee would prove to be a prophet on top of a talented writer, editor, and marketer, as all of DC's work would implode within 3 months, turning the hyped DC explosion into the dreaded DC implosion, leading to half of the line being canceled. Of the 50 titles released by DC in the previous 3 years, only 6 would survive in 1978. Some had argued this was openly a good thing for DC, as it allowed the company to clear out some of the dead weight, while also being able to experiment with new formats, such as producing the first limited series with the 3-issue World of Krypton in 1979. Marvel benefited as well, as many of these out-of-work creators came back to them, which also included Jack Kirby, who returned to Marvel back in 1975 when his DC contract expired. Plus, it was during this time that another Marvel franchise entered into popularity that would send Marvel into even greater heights: the X-Men. While initially popular as Stan Lee and Jack Kirby when it was first released back in 1963, the X-Men had fallen on hard times, with even being repainted for a significant portion of its run. With sales so low at the time, what would today be a very nice $100,000 issue, the X-Men even faced cancellation, and it was then decided to give them a revamp. The artist for the job was Dave Cockrum, who was left DC for Marvel with a new character in tow. Cockrum originally considered putting him in the Legion of Superheroes comic for DC, but the editors thought the blue-skinned devil character would be too scary and weird for their comic. Marvel found him perfect for the X-Men, though, and soon Nightcrawler joined the ranks of the team alongside new members Colossus, Thunderbird, Storm, Banshee, Sunspot, Wolverine, and team leader Cyclops. The new team was truly international, with Colossus being from Russia to Wolverine being Canadian, while Cochrum's own Nightcrawler was German. The launch was Giant Size X-Men #1 in February of 1975 with writer Len Wein, which established a new team and set the comic on a path for dominating the market. It was followed up by the relaunch of Uncanny X-Men with issue number 94 on May 1975, with art by Cockrum and writing by Chris Claremont. John Byrne would replace Dave Cockrum when he left the book in 1977 with issue number 108, and soon the duo of Claremont and Byrne would turn the Uncanny X-Men into one of the comic's premier books, with a legendary run that would include his classic storylines as Days of Future Past and the Dark Phoenix Saga. By June of 1979, Marvel had truly dominated the American comic book marketplace, with the closest DC book being a fantasy series Warlord at number 21 in sales. Plus, the company just got a new editor-in-chief in Jim Shooter, who would have a controversial but ultimately successful run in the role. However, his aggressive leadership style would run off many of Marvel's veterans, notably Roy Thomas, Gene Colan, and Marv Wolfman to DC. Shooter would joke that DC needed top-quality talent, so he understood why they poached from Marvel. Wolfman, in particular, would help revive the Teen Titans, a team book consisting of the sidekicks of the major superheroes such as Robin and Kid Flash, with George Perez, first in DC Comics Presents, number 26, which was inserted free of charge at considerable cost to DC, and then the New Teen Titans #1 in August of 1980. The book was so good that many jokingly called it DC's first Marvel book, or DC's X-Men, as it started to rival that series' sales. This would be the start of a banner decade for DC, as for the first time since the emergence of Marvel, DC was starting to gain good press again. The new decade would also mark a renewal in the rivalry between Marvel and DC, fueled by Jim Shooter's leadership, along with the distancing of the company offices, which were now 30 blocks from one another instead of just being in walking distance. When DC raised its price from 40 to 50 cents, Marvel scoffed, saying they would never do that, only to do just that 2 months later, leading to DC to paper their offices with those previous quotes from Marvel. Even the friendly inter-company softball game became bitter as Shooter, who played first base, started to suspect that DC was bringing in ringers to win the game, to the point that he questioned one DC player over his job, who could only reply, I'm in production. To continue on with this new decade in rivalry, DC penned a new ad, "There's no stopping us," but when some poor sale figures came out, Marvel jokingly added, "There's no stopping us, because they are going downhill." This friction continued between the companies, though some crossovers were launched. First with Superman and Spider-Man in July of 1981, then Batman vs. the Incredible Hulk in 1982, and finally the Uncanny X-Men and the New Teen Titans that same year. Originally, it was supposed to be the Legion of Superheroes, but it was replaced by the Titans due to its new popularity. Superman and Spider-Man was especially frustrating, with both Marvel and DC fighting over deadlines, even though the verses were replaced with "and" to signify a new cooperation. Finally, a plan was announced against the Justice League of America to meet the Avengers for 1982, with Jerry Conway and George Perez tasked with producing it. However, clashes over the story forced its cancellation, with Perez even leaving the project in frustration and stating he would refuse to ever work with Marvel again as long as Jim Shooter was there. DC would eventually return Perez's unused artwork from the project in 1994, which he promptly sold. The bitterness was so bad, both companies produced rival editorials to explain to fans why it failed, and it will be decades before the Justice League and the Avengers would ever finally meet. While Marvel dominated the comic book front, the one place DC continued to shine was in TV and film adaptations. Back in 1940, DC had a Superman balloon in the Macy's Day Parade, along with the classic Max Fleischer Superman cartoon from 1941 to 42. By 1943, Batman had his own movie serial, followed by Superman's in 1948. As for Marvel, their Captain America movie serial in 1944 was an embarrassment that had little to do with the character. He was a district attorney who donned a mask to fight crime, and it wouldn't be until 1974 that the Marvel character would appear in live action again, that being the Spider-Man segments on the PBS series The Electric Company. Then in the 1950s, the highly successful The Adventures of Superman TV show aired, followed by the 1960s by the campy but immensely popular Adam West Batman show, which earned DC $1,000 an episode plus 20% of the profits. Meanwhile, the best Marvel could do was the Marvel Superheroes cartoon in 1966, which was so poorly animated it featured panels swiped from the comic books, and then Ralph Bakhti's Amazing Spider-Man cartoon, a campy but flawed effort, though it did produce that catchy Spider-Man song, along with the now popular meme of two Spider-Mans pointing at one another. A lot of this had to do with Marvel not knowing how to license their characters or even their value. At one point, the rights were sold for $2,500 by Chip Goodman, Martin Goodman's son, and then 12 characters' rights were sold to Universal for $12,500 in 1976. The latter led to the infamous Spider-Man live-action TV show in 1977, which had little to do with the comic, but also the more finely received Incredible Hulk show that same year, which lasted for 5 seasons. DC wasn't sitting idly by, producing the popular Wonder Woman TV show in 1975 starring Linda Carter. All this would peak in 1978 when Superman the Movie, starring Christopher Reeves and directed by Richard Donner, was released that December, setting box office records and critical acclaim. Even Superman's creators, Joel Siegel and Joe Shuster, tearfully thanked director Richard Donner for doing the film right. The film was so good it made comic books reputable again, though it would be years before the rest of the industry followed up. Even DC took its time, with the B-movie Swamp Thing, directed by the late great horror master Wes Craven, being the next film in 1982. It didn't help that after the superlative Superman 2 in 1980, even that film franchise started to go downhill, with the failure of 1984's Supergirl movie, and then Superman 3 in 1983 and 4 in 1987. While Superman the Movie set a new standard in comic book films that is still considered the model to follow, both Sam Raimi and Patty Jenkins, the directors of Spider-Man and Wonder Woman respectively, cited as a chief inspiration for their films. It will be more than a decade before the rest of the industry truly caught on. It did establish that while DC was lagging the comic books department, it still led at other mediums, at least for now. Back in the comic book front, the industry was changing with the invention of the direct market, which allowed the publishers to sell directly to retailers, leading to an explosion of comic book shops and specialty stores. In 1974, it accounted for $300,000 of Marvel's profits, but by 1979, it was $6 million. Another plus, that unlike the newsstand networks, the direct market had no return policy at the time, allowing Marvel and DC, along with other publishers, to be more daring in their products. With so much money coming in, Marvel hired Mike Friedrich in 1980 to handle their direct market, while DC followed in 1981 by hiring Paul Kupperberg. One of Friedrich's first tasks was to test how viable the direct market was with the release of the Dazzler in December of 1980, which was exclusive only to comic book stores through the direct market. Despite being C-level character from the X-Men, it sold 428,000 copies. DC would follow suit with Madame Xanadu in April of 1981 at a then unheard of price of $1, but it still sold 100,000 copies. By 1982, 50% of Marvel's sales was through the direct market and accounted for 70% of their profits. The direct market also gave a more direct line to fans, and the company started tailoring their books to their taste. DC produced Camelot 3000 in 1982, the first maxi series, a limited series that went over 6 issues, in Camelot's Case 12, and then Omega Man in April of 1983. Marvel put out the Death of Captain Marvel book in 1982 for $5.95 and sold 200,000 copies. Fans also demanded higher quality paper and art, something that the creators wanted as well, which led to Ronin by Frank Miller in 1983 from DC. It was originally a concept that Miller was planning to use at Marvel, having already successfully revived Daredevil for the company, but DC president Jeanette Kahn managed to lure him away with one of the most lucrative contracts in comic history, along with a guarantee of quality printing and paper. Kahn also produced another innovation to recruit creators to DC as well, when she finally able to launch her royalty program, part of a long-standing promise to treat creators better, providing 2% sales revenue to writers for issues that sold over 100,000, 1.4% for artists, and 0.4% for inkers. The last was something that Dick Giorgiano, being an inker himself, pushed for. Marvel's editor-in-chief Jim Shooter claimed to have come up with the idea of royalties first, but the Marvel brass had shot him down. However, once DC put their plan into effect, Marvel, for the first time in decades, actually was following them. This would be a benefit for Marvel in the end, since Marvel books sold exceedingly more than DC, leading to higher royalties for the creators, and as a result, paid out $2 million in their first year once the program was instituted. Jeanette Kahn was famous for her recruiting techniques, even inviting creators to dinner parties at her apartment where they would find cookies baked in the shape of their characters. For example, Walt Simonson had Thor cookies made for him. Strangely, all these efforts would seem to be for naught, as on February of 1984, Marvel was given a chance to license DC outright. Bill Sarnoff, the head of Warner Brothers, was tired of DC Comics continuing to lose money and thus approached Marvel to license and produce its comics. While DC lost money making comics directly, the licensing and the merchandise was lucrative, thus Sarnoff wanted to offload the comics to Marvel, who actually made money doing comics, while using them to promote their various TV, film, and merchandising licenses. It was a seemingly win-win for everyone. DC would unload a losing part of their company, while Marvel would gain a lucrative new assets, and also establishing ties with Warner Brothers for their own future licensing deals. The initial plan called for Marvel to publish 7 comics based on DC's core characters: Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Green Lantern, Justice League, Teen Titans, and Legion of Superheroes. Jim Shooter loved the idea, but decided to run the numbers just to be sure, only to learn that even a conservative estimate would net Marvel $3.5 million in its first 2 years. Ed Shulkin, Marvel's circulation head, argued it would be double that. Marvel would even receive a cut over any license Warner Brothers produced from the books as well, and could help Marvel finally develop their own licenses with the Marvel characters. Ultimately, it never went through due to outside factors, when First Comics, an indie publisher best known for Howard Chaykin's American Flag series, sued Marvel over anti-competitive practices, claiming it was flooding the markets with books to keep smaller publishers off the racks. Acquiring DC would not have helped Marvel's case, and thus it was dropped, leading many to endlessly wonder what would have happened if it had went through. And we will leave you there for now, but after DC dodges that bullet, they will come roaring back in the 1980s and truly challenging Marvel, and both will end up reshaping the entire industry in the 1990s and beyond. And now is February 5th, 2026, time for the favorite comic of the week. Absolute Superman number 16 by Jason Aaron and Juan Ferreira. I maybe pronounced that last name badly, I apologize. But this is a great issue where Superman, who's now fully formed into Superman guise, runs into Hawkman, who is not quite the Hawkman from the regular universe, and tries to almost recruit Superman to come to his side, but they don't quite see eye to eye. And Superman wants to be a straight superhero, while Hawkman is saying, no, you need to play it more coyly and make slow changes, where he's just trying to upset the entire system. And it ends up leading to a fantastic fight. Meanwhile, Lois Lane gets a new job, and Lex Luthor looks like he's going to finally be pulled into the fold. Oh no, this is a great issue with some great action scenes, and Jason really has a great time, almost getting to the more naturalistic Superman that's from the regular universe into the absolute one. That's the point. Superman's actually being Superman here. He's like flying off in the middle of conversations with Hawkman to save somebody from falling out of a tree and stuff like that, which is hilarious because Hawkman gets so frustrated with it. And also you see in Lois Lane's job's a big tail. And, of course, Lex Luthor. So, and Ferraria's art is gorgeous, has nice, gritty, and very action-packed, especially the scenes when Superman at one point just throws Hawkman through multiple layers of this parking garage. Very cool stuff. Great splash pages. So, yeah, strangely enough, this is probably the most underrated of the absolute universe comics of at least of the big three. Of course, Absolute Batman's still the coolest one, and you have Absolute Wonder Woman as well. It's really cool stuff too, but this one is starting to become really more of a straightforward superhero story, and it's really great to check out. And with that, we will conclude with this archive edition of the History of Comics podcast. Join me again next week for the final part of the archived Marvel vs. DC. And until then, go out and enjoy some good comic book, and definitely check out Absolute Superman and, well, all the Absolute Universe comics. They're all just fantastic.